All right, welcome everybody. Please come on in and get settled. Glad you're with us today. And I am going to get started with a slow introduction because we're still at 11:59. I don't want to do anything too official until noon, but come on in, please say hello. We'll read off a couple of salutations before we get started. I see Cynthia has already said hello from Baltimore, Jeffrey from the Upper West Side, Robert Morbo-Morbeck from Rutledge, Pennsylvania, Nicole from St. Louis, Robin all the way down in Florida. Hello from hell, she says. With the real feel of 99. Wow, that's intense, Robin. And Richard, wow. I'm assuming you guys are near each other. Hello from warm Florida. Nancy from Arizona, probably warm as well. Martha, good to see you, Martha from Hanover, New Hampshire. Wendy from the Upper West Side. Eileen from Fearington Village, North Carolina. And we're at noon, so I'm going to do official introductions, and please continue to say hello. But I welcome everybody today to our book talk on the Barbizon, the hotel that set women free. We are led today by the book's author, Paulina Bren. There's also a link to purchase the book at the top of the chat here. I will also put it at the bottom of the chat towards the end of the presentation as well. But just a couple of things. If you are new to Livestorm in this format, or if you're new to Untapped New York, my name is John. I'm Chief Experience Officer with Untapped New York. If you're new to Livestorm, if you're having a little bit of audio or visual trouble, you can just refresh your page. You'll be brought right back in. Also, this chat and this recording will be made available to you right after this presentation. A couple minutes after, you'll be sent a link to the recording, and the chat remains live. So if there's any information or any questions that you had that you were looking for the answers to, you'll be able to find them later on. Lastly, we welcome our insiders here. They are here for a $10 a month subscription, for a virtual subscription. If you are not an insider, we welcome you to literally join us. You can try for a month free by using the code JOINUS at the link also posted in the chat. So welcome, everybody. Paulina, it's a pleasure to have you. I have my copy of the book right here.
Yay.
And I am going to let you get started. And as soon as you want me to put up the presentation, just let me know.
Okay, hello everybody. I was going to say hello from a sunny day in New York, assuming you were all in New York, and I'm blown away by the different locations. It's wonderful, actually. I'm very excited to be here. So Justin, you can put up the presentation. As you all know, I am going to be talking about my book, The Barbizon, today. Hopefully we'll get that. There we go. We have the presentation up. So my book, The Barbizon, which came out quite recently, and I could see from the chat that at least a couple of you have read it already. And it's a joy to present on the book, but always also, you know, there's the aspect that the book, I hope, is more complex and much richer than one can possibly do in 45 minutes. So bear with me as I sort of give you a quick tour through the Barbizon and sort of what I wrote about. So the Barbizon, I think most of you perhaps, but maybe not, know it to be a hotel that was quite famous through the 20th century. And I'm going to start by talking about the Barbizon as the image, as the place it wanted to present itself to be, which in many ways it was, but there was, as I say, a great complexity behind the walls of the Barbizon as well. So this was a matchbox from the Barbizon, and very much this tagline, New York's most exclusive residence for young women. The hotel was on Lexington, is still, well, now the condos, on Lexington and 63rd Street. But this was its tagline, and certainly the image that it had and continues to have in many ways. The bell jar might also have been a way that if you know something about the Barbizon that you came to it. It certainly was for me. Sylvia Plath famously wrote The Bell Jar actually 10 years after she had spent a month at the Barbizon in 1953. And I have to say, speaking with her cohorts, it's a pretty accurate description of her time there, including the ways in which she arrived with great enthusiasm and left sort of on the verge of suicide. It was a difficult month for her there. And in the novel, The Bell Jar, I was sort of, when I read it, I was fascinated, but she calls the Barbizon the Amazon there, and she calls herself, the protagonist, Esther. And on the last night that Esther is in the hotel, she goes up to the roof and she throws her carefully curated wardrobe over the side of the roof onto the streets below. And I was sort of fascinated by that as an act. And also fascinated by the hotel where you can go to the roof and throw over your clothes. So in a sense, that had me sort of start thinking about the Barbizon and if maybe I could actually write a history about it and about the women who stayed there. So the hotel was built in 1927, opened its doors in 1928. Here you can see a very different kind of 63rd Street than it is today. The hotel, it was for women only. It was a women's residential hotel, and it was not the only one. It's certainly the one that, first of all, managed to survive for quite a long time, and certainly the one that had the most glamorous, sort of sexiest reputation. But the 1920s were a time in New York when lots of women-only hotels were going up. And this was, of course, because after World War I and the women's vote, women had suddenly the chance to lead more independent lives. And they were heading to New York and they wanted to stay somewhere. They didn't want to stay in boarding houses. They wanted the same kind of modern living for modern women that men had. And indeed, developers, such as in the case of the Barbizon, William Silk, they had been building these residential hotels for men for a couple of decades. And now, of course, they saw a new profit to be made, and they started to build these residential hotels for women. And the Barbizon, from the very beginning, was built for a particular clientele. So not only the young women, as they say, but also young women who wanted to pursue a career in the arts. And so from the beginning, it was built, as other hotels were, with, obviously in this case, really a beautiful facade, Art Deco, sort of neo-Renaissance and so forth. It's been described many ways. And the public spaces were always very beautiful. In this case, the typical bedroom, the amount of young women who stayed there found that postcard in the drawer of their desk in their room and wrote home and said, "My room looks nothing like this. It's so much smaller. This is some sort of suite that nobody ever sees, but it's on the postcard." But in addition, the way it was built with obviously a swimming pool, a gym, because this is the time now women were working out as well. But for the women who were interested in Korean arts, music studios were built into the hotel. Art studios were built in. A recital room was built in. So it was really trying to cater to these women. And here's a brochure from 1936, which will give you sort of a better view of the hotel itself. And this very fantastical sort of spatial map on the right was something that actually continued for many decades going forward. I love this idea, sort of the Barbizon is close to Carnegie Hall Radio City and the theaters somehow, but it's obviously a fantasy spatial map. This was the hotel. The lobby. What was particularly interesting about this, and you'll see it in another picture I'm going to show you, this mezzanine here, where women would be up there and they could look down into the lobby. So men were allowed in the lobby. They were allowed at some points to go up to the roof garden for a dinner if they were accompanied by, obviously, a resident, and they would get a special pass to just go up there. But men were not allowed on the mezzanine. They were allowed in that lobby. So women would often be up on the mezzanine looking down to see who's dating whom, who came for whom, and so forth. Here you see on the right also, in the way that these residential hotels, and particularly the Barbizon, was a place to really live, a place to socialize, and in this case, to try to sort of start to build your career as an artist. And here you can see court circular. There were activities for the week. You would receive this the slip of paper at the beginning of each week. The swimming pool here, a room that is more of a normal sized room as it was. And here it seems like a father out having dinner in a roof garden with his daughter there. And to give you a sense again of how the hotel was advertising itself. So these are ads from the 1940s. And if you look on the far left, I think this is a particularly key line here. It says, so why stay here? Because of the serene atmosphere, the many cultural and physical activities, and the freedom from housekeeping cares make living here ideal. This was actually important. And those who built and staffed the Barbizon understood it as being important, that this was a chance for women to lead independent lives. One, because to come to New York as a single young woman in the late 1920s and decades going forward, you had safety if you had respectability. So the hotel was very respectable, and that was also part of women only aspect to it. But also there was a very conscious understanding that if women did not have kitchens, did not have housekeeping to drag them down, they could actually focus on their lives. Here's some from the 1950s, and there we see how they also start to sort of, here on the left, it says you might find many of your own classmates are here at the hotel as well. And on the right-hand side, we see Mount Holyoke, class of 1957, now a model at J. Thorpe. This kind of advertisement in the 50s was particularly common, sort of showcasing women who had gone to these elite colleges and who are now in New York taking on different jobs. And then the 1960s, same idea, modernized a little bit. And just to give you a sense of the feel of being there as well. Simply a letter from Hugh Connor, who was the manager for a very long period of time. And that was important, that he had a real relationship with the residents. And you can see here, he's thanking somebody who stayed for almost 2 years. This is a telephone message from one of the characters, one of the women in my book, Nanette Emery, who arrived there in 1945, very soon, obviously, after the end of World War II. But then we have sort of what is actually going on during this whole time, right? So the hotel opens its doors in 1928. In October 1929 is the stock market crash, followed by the Great Depression. And so on the one hand, the Barbizon Hotel is for the glamorous young woman. Obviously, the suggestion being not only is she white, of course, or, you know, this is the time period of automatic segregation. Not only that, but the idea is she's of a certain class. Well, now is the Great Depression, and these same women are coming to New York and staying at the Barbizon because they need to work. Now it's not just some sort of amusement or some aspiration they have perhaps for a few years before they go back home and they get married. Now they need to make a living. And there are two contingents of women that really dominate the hotel in the 1930s. One of them is the Catherine Gibbs Secretarial School students, the Gibbs girls. I don't know how many of you have heard of them. Back in the day when I still remember Gibbs girls, it was just, to me, it just was any old secretarial school at the time. Seemed very sort of outdated. But the Gibbs School was a phenomenon of the 20th century. Catherine Gibbs started the school in the early 1900s as a widow in her 40s, had to figure out a way to make a living and support her family. And she was a marketing genius, and she came up with this very posh Catherine Gibbs Secretarial School. And so in the 1930s, so actually even prior to the Great Depression, women who'd gone to Vassar, who'd gone to Smith and so forth, and gone to the Sorbonne, they would sometimes finish it off with a certificate from Catherine Gibbs, which they would never use. These same women were now clamoring to get in because this was their stepping stone to a good job. So they were coming to New York, going to the school, and Catherine Gibbs actually took over 2 and then 3 floors of the hotel as the dormitory for the Gibbs girls. Another contingent was the Powers models. John Powers' agency was, I think, the first modeling agency in America. And the Powers models, he was famous for bringing women over from Middle America, small town American. The hotel was very much about small town American women. And he would encourage them to stay at the Barbizon Hotel, just as Eileen Ford would later on with her agency, the Ford agency. And again, the Powers girls, they were working models. They were not supermodels. This was a very hard job. And what's interesting is that these 2 contingents of working women in the hotel in the 1930s, they were taking on jobs that they could not be accused of taking from men. And this was very important. Women who were working were targets. And in that sense, because the idea was that they should leave jobs for men who rightfully should have those jobs. And so the Barbizon really became a sanctuary in many ways, a safe place at this time. So we have sort of that, sort of the facade, which is legitimate, but we have a history taking place at the same time to which these women and the hotel is responding. And the hotel survived because it pivoted, because it understood that it would continue to be the place for young, ambitious, artistically inclined young women, but that was meaning something else from the Great Depression onwards. And then, of course, we have sort of the history of the hotel in terms of the famous women who stayed there, which is a way that many of you might have first heard about it. So here on the left, we have Oscar, the doorman, who was sort of a very famous doorman at the Barbizon. And it was funny, I was doing an interview on all of it with Alison Stewart on WNYC, and they were asking for call-ins, and the grandson of Oscar called in, and it was wonderful. And he had great stories about visiting when he was a little boy and swimming in the swimming pool. I suppose they let him in. And I say they let him in because there were, of course, as soon as men are not allowed, then of course getting in becomes something of sort of a badge of honor and rebellion. And so certainly at the front desk, May Sibley, who, like Hugh Connor, was a real fixture there, and she was at the front desk. She would often be called to the front desk, and somebody was there because somebody was there posing as an on-call doctor, usually an on-call gynecologist in a doctor's uniform. And she, of course, knew better and would send them away. Malachy McCourt, I don't know if any of you know of him. He's a writer, sort of a bon vivant in his 90s now, but remarkable. And of course, he's the brother of Frank McCourt of Angela's Ashes. And he started really Malachy's, which was in many ways the first singles bar / kind of restaurant, very close to the Barbizon. And it was a real hot spot because he ran with celebrities, and of course the allure of the Barbizon women 2 blocks away, and Barbizon women would indeed come in, as would Catherine Gibbs girls. And he claims he made it up the stairs back in the day when he was a drinker, and he had enough fuel in him, so to speak, to run up those stairs, do what they did, and then sort of make it out of the hotel alive. But there were others who claimed that. And we'll get to that in terms of when they did actually let men in. So there is, as I say, Oscar was the famous sort of guard dog. of the Barbizon, and then the famous women in many ways who were not famous at the time. And this is one of the really interesting things about sort of discovering the Barbizon. It's very interesting to see these young women, because this book is really, in many ways, it's a story of New York, a story of this hotel, and a story of women's ambition. And it's interesting to see these young women who are going to be famous later, but to see them in their young, awkward, insecure moments, where you really see how they are a part of their environment. They are not unique in many ways. And Grace Kelly was part of that. She was there in the 1940s. And she was from Philadelphia. Her father was a millionaire, self-made millionaire. She didn't get into Bennington because of lots of the soldiers returning from World War II. They had priority, so she didn't get a spot in Bennington. She was able to convince her parents that she would go to New York, and they said, only if you stay at the Barbizon. And at the same time, her best friend there, who lived next door to her, was Carolyn Scott. And this is where, as much as the hotel advertised itself as being of a certain socioeconomic class, in fact, it was not the case. There was a real mix. There were debutantes, but then there were people like Carolyn Scott, who was from rural Ohio and who had saved money through, in her case, through a beauty contest. And this was very common. These local beauty contests where the winner would win either some money that would get them to New York, or an interview with John Powers or one of the other two then agency owners that started up. And so she was one of these, and she was determined to come to New York and be a model. She was very smart about it. And they became best friends, and they were in many ways opposite. Carolyn Scott was quiet, shy, but beautifully dressed. She made her own clothes. And Grace Kelly was not shy. She would like to dance. She used to apparently dance topless in the hallways of the Barbizon. But she came in Philadelphia wearing tweeds, sort of wearing her glasses, looking very mousy at the beginning. And here you see them together at a gala. And this photo, I love the one on the right. In fact, this photo is published by one of the press articles about my book. And Carolyn Scott's daughter was thrilled because she'd only seen this photo before where it was cut off and you didn't see that mezzanine up there that I was talking about where women would peek over. And in fact, that is her mother, Carolyn Scott, up there leaning over with her elbows on the mezzanine balcony there. And it's a wonderful photo too, because it's sort of, it's the women looking down, checking out what's going on. It's the glamorous young woman meeting her date, and it's the older women in the background, and I'll get to that, who are looking on and obviously gossiping. So it's very sort of evocative of what the Barbizon on many different levels in terms of its residents could be. I have to absolutely talk about Mademoiselle magazine for a moment. Mademoiselle magazine, again, back in the day, when I say back in the day, I think I mean the 1980s. When Mademoiselle still existed, I certainly saw it as just a frivolous magazine sort of geared for teenagers and very sort of fluff, and I wasn't very interested in it. But Mademoiselle, I discovered, had a very different history, and it was a powerhouse. It was a powerhouse. It was a magazine started in the mid-1930s, and it catered to young women, indeed sort of teenagers to mid-20s. It was about fashion, though. For the first time, it was fashion that people could afford, and first they did it very discreetly, and then quite boldly they would actually write the price of the clothes, which was very unusual. But at the same time, it was a magazine that published cutting-edge fiction. Truman Capote's first story in 1945 was in Mademoiselle. Dylan Thomas in Mademoiselle, Flannery O'Connor. I mean, it was Carson McCullers. I mean, it was, and in part, this was because they didn't have a huge budget for fiction, so they had to find the up-and-coming writers. And the person, I could talk about Betsey Talbot Blackwell for ages, but I'll just make it a minute. She was the editor-in-chief. As you can see, she was known for hats. A newspaper once wrote about the fact that that she probably had a bath with a hat on, and it's maybe possible. But she is also a testament to how hard it is to make assumptions about what women were and what they were doing, even when there wasn't a women's rights movement that made things accessible to them. So she was, in 1935, she was brought in to help with this magazine that just started and had faltered. She became editor-in-chief the following year and was editor-in-chief until 1970. And she was brilliant. She was also an anomaly. She was a staunch Republican, obviously among lots of, literati lefties. What she created was, it used to be a magazine publishing. August was a completely dead month. And she made it the most lucrative month. First of all, she decided, okay, we're all getting older. We're catering to young women. So we have to create a network of young readers who are going to report back to headquarters what they're thinking, what they're talking about, what they're doing, what they're wearing. So immediately, I mean, advertisers heaven, right? But then she said, in the early 1940s, she said, okay, and now we're going to start a guest editor program, an internship, a contest. This contest became the thing that every ambitious, talented young woman in America wanted to win. And if you won, you were brought to New York, you stayed at the Barbizon for the month of June. We can see where this is heading with Sylvia Plath for the month of June. And you shadowed the editors at the Mademoiselle, and you were, of course, wined and dined throughout New York, and you were photographed for the magazine, and you also wrote for the magazine, though that was a whole other tricky issue, which I don't have time to get into. So as I said, this obviously leads to Sylvia Plath, the bell jar. That's why she was there in 1953 for the month of June. Sorry, just watching the time. So she did have a very difficult time of it. She had been there about 6 weeks earlier and had the most remarkable time of her life in New York. Oysters and French restaurants and Broadway shows and intellectual conversations, Delmonico's, and it was just everything she could have dreamed of. And she came in June thinking she'd have the same experience, and she had very much the opposite. And of course, then left at the end of that, went back home to Massachusetts, and probably her first attempt at suicide then. Another famous woman, 1955, Joan Didion. You can see here in the magazine. And again, when I write about Joan Didion, I also juxtapose her with one of her best friends that she was there with as well. And I find this to be really important to sort of, biographies tend to, of course, sort of illuminate a person to the point where obviously they're contextualized, but there seems to be something that made them particularly special. Well, yes, but it's really interesting to see how these women in the 1950s, how they grappled with the same issues, because for all the ambition, the end point for every young woman, particularly in the 1950s, was you have to get married. And in fact, your sell-by date is going to be very early. So all of these women, regardless of where their paths led them, were grappling with these issues. And the Barbizon was a place where they were doing a lot of that grappling. In 1958, also through Mademoiselle, Ali McGraw came as, she won the contest as an artist, actually. But she was, for the first time ever, they placed a guest editor, first and only time, on the front cover. And in many ways, this is how her career, not in many ways, that is how her career began, as a model and then an actress. Betsey Johnson, the designer, was there in 1964. You might wonder why they're in London. The Mademoiselle editors, while this was a contest that, as I say, was so influential, so important, it's such an introduction to life in New York, be it for better or worse. The editors were not happy having these young women sort of having to deal with these young women in the month of June. So there came a point where part of the contest was you spent a week abroad on a special trip that was photographed. So in the case of Betsey Johnson, they headed off to London. Now, this is very interesting because, of course, here I am writing about this hotel, doing research. I can talk more about the research aspect, but I went into this thinking, oh, glamorous, famous hotel, there'll be so many sources. No, not at all. No remaining documents whatsoever. This was an incredibly difficult book to piece together, sort of rebuild the Barbizon. And I felt that somehow the question of the Barbizon's whiteness, and when perhaps it started to diversify a bit, it was really important to answer. And without documents, how do you answer that? Fortunately, I found that the Mademoiselle memos, sort of office memos and that sort of document that had belonged to Betsey Talbot Blackwell was at an archive in Laramie, Wyoming. And I was going through thousands of these sort of mundane memos, and I finally came across this heated debate in 1956 among the staff of Mademoiselle, and sort of the editorial staff versus the business side of Mademoiselle. And the editorial staff wanted to invite a contestant that they felt was the best artist that year, was beautiful, was talented, and everything. The only problem is she was Black. She was African American. And the business side said, you cannot do this. We're sick of Mademoiselle wanting to do all these firsts just for the sake of being first. And you have to understand, at that point, no Black woman had ever appeared on the pages of a white mainstream magazine. And these contestants were photographed. So she was going to be in the magazine. And the business side said, no, we're going to lose readers. We're going to lose Southern clientele. We're going to advertisers. No way. But Betsey Talbot Blackwell said, no, she's coming. And she was brought in. And one of the big questions in that heated debate was, will the Barbizon even let her stay there? Nobody knew. Well, the Barbizon did let her stay there. They didn't tell her there was a swimming pool. But they let her stay there. And according to her, she had no problems there whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying her time there created sort of, a floodgate of diversity or anything like that. But it's important to mark that moment in 1956 when she is at the hotel. And I should say Barbara Chase Ribaud, which she actually hyphenated because she was emulating Betsey Talbot Blackwell, is a famous artist, sculptor, and a writer as well. And you can see her pieces at MoMA and at the Met. So, sorry, checking time again. So 1960s come along. In many ways, the reason that the Barbizon came into existence also became its death knell. So it was built for women to lead independent lives. And as women, particularly the second wave women's movement, start to lead independent lives, they don't want to stay at this nunnery anymore, as they call it. They don't want to stay where men are not allowed in past the lobby. And so you start to see, I love this. This is the recital room on the left with this massive organ. And here you have a tea time. There was always a tea for free. Apart from maid service, you had tea. And a lot of the young women who were not well off would actually use that tea as their dinner. It was, a way of, eating, frankly. and being able to afford to stay at the Barbizon. So this was tea time, and this woman here playing the organ, this really became the story of the Barbizon from the 60s onwards, where you have this young clientele now starting to clash with older women, or the women as they are called. And here we have also on the right, I just want to include that. I talk more about it in the book, but the coffee shop, the Barbizon coffee shop, really played a role as well in New York. And it was, you could access it either from the street or from the hotel itself. And you start to see, the Barbizon looking different, 1977, then the 1980s. And indeed, I think somebody here, I had a couple of friends who were guest editors, including Meg Wolitzer. Exactly. Meg Wolitzer was there as the last group of Mademoiselle guest editors in 1979. And she wrote a piece about it. And I just love this. She said that New York at that time was looking like an episode of Kojak. I hope that reference means something to some of you. Certainly does to me. And it's a wonderful description. And indeed, there was a hole in the ceiling in the lobby, and the things were looking run down as New York was. And occupancy rates were just taking a nosedive. So even though the women, and this is perfect here on the right-hand side, you see the women huddled together in the lobby. They would just camp out there all evening and comment on everything and everyone. They were adamant that the women, that men not come in. But in 1981, men had to come in because the occupancy rates were too low. It couldn't continue as a women's only hotel. And there was a big raffle, a party of who was going to be the first man handed a key who could go up to the bedroom area. And it was Dr. Cleveland from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Anyway, but soon after this happened and men were allowed in on Valentine's Day weekend in 1981, the hotel actually closed and a whole series of renovations began. And at this time, the women here, they also hired a tenant lawyer. And I'll get to that in a second, why that was so important. So now the hotel for the next 2 decades went through different incarnations of being a regular hotel. Sorry, this is terrible photographs. I actually photographed these in the lobby of the Barbizon 63, which is the luxury condo building that it is today. And they had this light above me that was shining onto these brochures. But it hopefully gives you some sense of how this hotel was being renovated, very much in the 1990s look. And then we see early 2000s. There's a certain Trumpian gold happening here, I would say. And throughout this, as I say, the women. Now, the women became early on something that the young residents feared. They feared them in the sense of, we don't want to become like them. The Barbizon Hotel was supposed to be a launching pad for ambitious women. And if you were still there past a certain age, it meant you didn't launch. And also at a certain time, it meant you didn't marry. So this was not something you wanted to be. But these women, I say they were sort of seen as the losers, but they're the ultimate victors. They hired a tenant lawyer as these renovations started. And it turned out that their rooms are rent control rooms, and they cannot be evicted. And so they continued to stay there. And as the hotel was being renovated, what would happen was that they continued to live sort of behind, on different floors, behind sort of a wall and a door, and you'd open that door and the old Barbizon was there. And they were living there. And of course, as the hotel continued to be renovated and as these women were also dying out, the number of women was declining. And in 2005, of course, New York was booming. And a lot of hotel owners saw that the market was for luxury condos. And indeed, the Barbizon went that way too. It was completely gutted. The swimming pool had already been rented out to Equinox, that whole area. Equinox actually pulled out the original swimming pool. Some of you might belong to the Equinox there. So that was already happening. A lot of the library and the recital room, all of that was gradually being taken over by Equinox. But they decided to completely gut it now and do a full renovation, because now they had to pass it off as luxury condos. So windows actually had to be enlarged. And the sort of the appearance of lower ceilings, because of being a women's hotel, sort of there had to be this sense of airiness created. And during this time, the women, along with the manager of the Barbizon, they were moved out to a different hotel while this happened. And then the women came back, and they have lovely small apartments on the 4th floor, I believe it is, where they continue to have daily maid service as if it's the Barbizon, and they pay rent control prices, again, as if they were still living at the Barbizon. And what I find really amusing is Ricky Gervais has an apartment at Barbizon 63, and the fact that he shares this space with the women is, to me, delightful. But that is the story in a nutshell in some ways, but obviously there's so much more to the story and to the stories of these women and the kind of struggles and decisions that they had to make while they were at the Barbizon, and also the way that really New York changed. So not just the expectations for these women and their restrictions and their freedoms, but at the same time, how New York and the hotel obviously was a part of those changes through the course of the 20th century into our 21st century. So thank you. Hopefully I have some questions.
Thank you, Paulina. Awesome. And I never knew that about the sort of later life past 2005. It really fascinating. And yeah, I love that image of Ricky Gervais living next to
I know, I do too.
It's great. So there have been there are 2 questions, but please continue to put some questions in the question tab for Paulina. First question came from Jeffrey Bernard. He said, any link between the hotel and the 1939 George Cukor movie, The Women?
Oh, The Women. Yes. If you read my book, you'll see that, in fact, the screenwriter, she went to live there for a while in order to write that about the hotel. So yes, absolutely. And there are a series of sort of films about these hotels. And of course, then there's the television series, which I actually never mentioned in the book, but Bosom Buddies with Tom Hanks, if anybody remembers that.
Yes.
That was, that's where his career started. And it was about New York, these 2 men who need affordable housing. And this is the other thing that, on the one hand, you can say, okay, well, the Barbizon, there's certainly people would relate to me, well, the Barbizon was a little bit more expensive than other sort of hotels or residences where women could stay, but still it was affordable housing as we understand it today. And that was, of course, the premise of Bosom Buddies, that it was worth it to them to pretend to be women in order to have a place to stay in Manhattan. And we can talk about the loss that places like this and the Barbizon have meant. I did want to quickly address Robert Moore here writes, I guess my parents went there for their 40th anniversary. Probably not. And you might be thinking about the Barbizon Plaza. William Silk built that as well. And the same architects. And so people sometimes confuse those. And the Barbizon Plaza also had, but it was for both men and women, it had a little bit also of that artistic reputation. Frida Kahlo stayed there. So it certainly had a little bit of that. But the Barbizon itself, the one I'm talking about, was very much about these young women. That is for whom it was. And of course, who that young woman was and what she was doing and what she was allowed to do and what she had to do changed over 100 years.
Right. Yes, I think Robert acknowledged. He's like,
yes,
yes.
Yes. I just wanted to clear that up because I've had friends who've written to me and said, yes, I'm like, no, you didn't.
Great. Chris Montgomery has a great question. He said, the research for the book was so impressive, but you said it was tough. Can you talk more about where you found information? He also then added, if there's time, can you talk about some of the interviews that you did?
Sure. I think I'll start that by saying that when I spent a year before this book came out bracing myself for the inevitable, which was that the stories I needed to get before I would now be hearing from people who read the book. And I knew that was going to happen. And sure enough, I get emails all the time. And actually, they're wonderful. I'd already come to terms with this, that this was going to happen. So they're always a cherry on the cake now at this point. So yes, the research, I assumed it would be easy. And I should say my prior two books, which are academic books, as opposed to a crossover book that everybody reads. My focus was on communism, and it was interesting, communism in the 70s and 80s behind the Iron Curtain. And in many ways, the research skills that I honed there ended up being really useful for this, because it turned out lots of people had tried to write a history of the Barbizon and they gave up because it's really hard to get at it. So first, I expected New York Historical Society archives, they have an entire archive of New York hotels. And so I thought, well, this is going to be it, right? This is the mother lode. Their file on the Barbizon is nothing, basically. And it's not, obviously not their fault. But it's a big question of why is there so little about this hotel? And I think, there are the accidents of history. I mean, the way that, for example, the hotel was gutted, the organ, those organs you saw, that organ was just ripped out. I mean, things were just ripped out, cast aside. And I can imagine all the paperwork was thrown into that same, dumpster. And that's what happens. But I think there's also an element of this was about young, frivolous women, seemingly, perhaps. And therefore, there is not the same impetus to save these materials before they go missing. So, and in terms of doing the research, thank goodness for my agent, who every time I wanted to give up, she said, no, keep trying. It'll take one thread. And certainly she was right to a certain extent. And the Mademoiselle as a gateway was really helpful because it allowed me to find women for whom also this was such an important moment in time that they were able to really remember these details. I mean, it was quite astonishing. For example, Peggy LaViolette, who was there with Joan Didion, and she remembered things which are remarkable. And I had to cross-reference one at some point because she claimed that when she was there in 1955, that Sylvia Plath came back to visit the offices of Mademoiselle, and she was very unimpressed. And then I had Janet Barraway, an amazing, wonderful writer, also, remembers everything beautifully. And she kept claiming that, no, there's no way Sylvia Plath was there. And I found in Plath's diary, like this one little sentence, how she visited the office. So these women, on the one hand, I mean, that was a joy to discover these women in their late 80s and 90s who were so articulate, so funny, and had really amazing memories, which I've never had. So it was through them. And then what the sort of researching sort of when I was writing about communism from a cultural historian's perspective, I'd learned to sort of juggle different, seemingly very different sources to create a picture. And I also learned, obviously, that you verify when you don't have records that can absolutely point you in the direction of, truth. You have verify, and if you hear something all the time, you can be fairly sure that you've got the story straight. So a lot of these different skills I sort of had to employ in order to write this. And there was a last bit to that question, which I don't remember.
To Chris's, well, he said talk about some of the interviews and which you did, and he just said talking more about how you found the information, which I think you covered.
Okay.
It was a great answer. Joe from London. Hi, Joe. Sorry if you said this at the beginning, but where does the name Barbizon come from?
I did not say it at the beginning. Exactly to emphasize the artistic bent that the hotel was supposed to be as it was being built. They chose the word Barbizon, or the term Barbizon, after the French art movement in the Barbizon in France. Sort of the Barbizon School of Art. And that's really what it was reflected on. And then, of course, I think, again, a lot of us who perhaps watched TV in the 1980s saw a lot of ads for Barbizon models and Barbizon modeling agency. Yeah. Right? I think they just ripped off the name from the Barbizon Hotel at that point. But the Barbizon Hotel very consciously used the name of an art movement.
Got it. I was wondering about that because I remember as a kid, you mentioned Bosom Buddies, you mentioned Kojak. These were all shows I was watching as I was growing up. So I was right there with you. And then I was thinking, God, I remember those ads for the
exactly. It has to be. I mean, this is why, of course, in the popular imagination, we also have, and that's why it was so powerful to call themselves the Barbizon Modeling Agency, I'm sure illegally, because, of course, the image of the Barbizon was still so powerful in the American imagination, because this, as I said, as I noted, this was a New York hotel, but it was a New York hotel for women from all over America. And that's really important to point out, that these are multiple stories of women. And this is where the ambition comes in, even if they didn't succeed. And I have a whole chapter on women who were just miserable there and did not succeed at all. But I personally think the fact that they got themselves to New York,
right,
and they tried, particularly for a lot of them, the time they were doing this, and they're heroes.
For sure. I remember when we met last week to do the tech check, and I said, I have a good friend whose aunt went to the Barbizon, and you're like, oh no, this is a great story.
Exactly. I knew that story. Exactly. I know there should be Barbizon too.
No. But one of the things that she talked about, which we obviously can very much sense even in today's culture, is she was a heavy-set young woman. Mm-hmm. And being at the Barbizon as a heavy set, she talked about this when she was telling me this story. She said, I was very headstrong and very confident, but there was a small part of me that always chipped away at the fact that I wasn't as beautiful as some of the women here. And, that picture of the women on the balcony looking down at the other women, she always said she was always one of those women on the balcony.
Yes, no, absolutely. And, this is of the many pressures exactly that I discuss, and Malachi McCourt was married to a woman who sort of escaped her parents on Park Avenue and went to live at the Barbizon, and she told him there were women lined up at the bathrooms. Remember, shared bathrooms in the hallways, because they were bulimic.
Right.
And at the same time, I talked to models who. Or one model in particular who had very mixed feelings about the fact that women would come to her room all the time to see if she could set them up on a double date. And it wasn't that they were looking for a man, they were looking for a meal. Right. And often the difference between having a date and not having one meant eating saltine crackers in your room or having a real meal. Mm. So there were, there were multiple sides to all of this, but absolutely what you said, yeah.
Suzanne has a great question. She said, what was the average length of tenancy for the girls who, quote unquote, made it and moved on?
It really It really depended. Jacqueline Smith, the actress who became Charlie's Angel, she was there as a dancer, and she was on and off. She was there for 2 years. And you read other stories of actresses you'll recognize who literally arrived, put their suitcase down. At the time, there used to be sort of these enormous auditions for multiple Broadway shows that were all created by the same producers, and they would just do a running and just an open call. They would put down their suitcase, they would go stand online, sing, and they were on Broadway the next day.
Wow.
So it enormous variations.
Yeah. Any other questions for Paulina while we are here? This has been a wonderful presentation and talk. This has been a great
been a joy.
Yes. Wait, we might have something else. Oh, Robert Morbeck said not a question, but there's Barbizon lighting as well. Used to rent theatrical gear from them.
There's also Barbizon. There was also, I always noticed in sort of Mademoiselle magazines and so forth, there was also Barbizon lingerie. Just saying.
Oh, there you go.
Saying.
Yeah, I guess I could see the link between the lingerie and the modeling. I'm not
the lighting.
Sure about the lighting. I'm not
Barbizon
sure.
Barbizon models, right?
Yeah, right. Oh, that's true. Joe says, so interesting. Can't wait to read the book. Thank you. Thank you for attending.
Yes, we'll go buy the book now.
Yes, the links. There are 2 links, one at the top and one right above here. Sarah says, I enjoyed the book. Beautifully done.
Thank you.
So really great praise here. And Richard asks, hi, Richard. What were the room rates?
Oh, really depended. Started off, it was around a lot of the time until we hit sort of, let me see, like 30s and 40s. I'd say it was like around $12 to $20 a week.
That doesn't sound so bad to us.
No, it doesn't. It does not.
I remember somewhere in the book it had, and I don't know if it was a caption or if it was in the book. I remember there was a $4 a day quote. Somewhere.
Yes. Yeah. And I think some of those ads I showed you, it was a $3 in the 1940s, a $3 a day or $12 a week, something like that. Yeah. It also depended because of how the economy was doing. Right. So during the 30s, it sort of dipped down, then it started to go up again. In the by the time, because to get a room, you had to come with recommendation letters.
Right.
And so there was this notion of prestige and obviously the market. So it depends. Were you applying in August when everybody else wanted to get in as well? Or were you coming in February? Were you, so it fluctuated.
Sure. Well, very, very good. Sarah enjoyed the book. Wendy can't wait to read it. So again, the links for purchasing the book are at the top of the chat and the bottom. This chat will remain active once you get the playback. And again, insiders, you will have this, not the chat, but you will have the recording as well. So a couple of upcoming events I'd like to let you guys know about. Tuesday, May 18th at 5 p.m. We're doing the book launch of Footnotes, the Black artist who rewrote the rules of the Great White Way, with author Kasim Gaines. Then on Wednesday, I am with you doing a presentation. It's the next installment of Lost New York, Mansions of Fifth Avenue. And that's at noon, so hopefully I will see you then. And then, actually, almost hand in hand, the next day we're doing the Waldorf Astoria and the Making of a Century with author David Freeland, who will talk about one of the spots I'll be talking about the day before. And then also for an insider-only in-person event, we have multiple dates this weekend, a chocolate and wine tasting tour aboard the Grain to Sail cargo sailboat, which is super cool and exciting. And tomorrow night, I am presenting, Untapped New York has been awarded the Grassroots Preservation Award by the Historic Districts Council, and I will be accepting and presenting our efforts to help preservation in New York City. Thank you, Robin, for congratulations. And Paulina, thank you very much again for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Really, really amazing presentation. As Joe just said, well done, agreed. Any final thoughts before I sign us off today?
No, just everybody enjoy the spring.
Yes, thank you. It's beautiful weather here.
And the COVID vaccines.
Yes. Enjoy, everybody. Thank you, Paulina. Everybody stay safe and see you soon.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.